Thank you for listening to The Luminous Mind. Remember to subscribe to our free podcast so you won't miss any of our illuminating content. Please enjoy this as we celebrate our 200th episode.
If I had the ability to have all of humanity know one thing, it's that, there's a reason why we say I feel stupid. And that's because stupid is a feeling. And specifically, it's the feeling of shame. And really, the feeling that you want to cultivate around mistakes is curiosity.
Benjamin Franklin once said, "Do not curse the darkness, rather light a candle instead." If you're ready to set your mind on fire, then prepare yourself for the Luminous Mind with your host, Rebecca Bowman.
Today's fire starter is Hunter Maats. After graduating from Eton College, Hunter Maats was selected by Nobel laureate James Watson, co-discoverer of the DNA double helix, to spend a year doing cancer research at the Cold Spring Harbor Lab. While there, he discovered just how often the divide in communication between the scientific community and the general public stands in the way of progress, an issue that would become the focus of his career. After graduating cum laude from Harvard University with a degree in biochemistry, Hunter founded Overqualified Tutoring, an educational services company which applied the latest neuroscience and psychology to help students of all ages succeed. As the company expanded, he and another of the company's co-founders realized the transformative force that they had created by introducing the science of learning directly to students. Along with Katie O'Brien, he synthesized 7 different fields in neuroscience and psychology and thousands of hours of tutoring experience into a single book that would inspire readers to take charge of their education. The Straight A Conspiracy, The Secret Guide to Ending the Stress of School and Totally Ruling the World, has received rave reviews from students, educators, and parents alike, and led Hunter and Katie to appear on dozens of TV and radio shows, including being interviewed by The Wire and profiled by Amazon as an innovative author. More importantly, the book has become a staple in several schools, community colleges, and even prison systems in the U.S. and globally. Finally, furthering his mission to bring the great ideas to people everywhere, Hunter also currently co-hosts Mixed Mental Arts, a podcast with over 250,000 downloads per month. In the show, he and host Brian Callen bring together comedians with leading thinkers and New York Times bestselling authors such as Jared Diamond, Carol Dweck, and MIT economist Darren Askell.
Listen, this is just a tough one. I mean, this is an unreasonable ask. I mean, you invite me on the show to have a conversation. I'm like, now speak Turkish. Why don't we go with it? We could, let's just say Darren.
Darren, okay. To discuss today's greatest issues and make the solutions accessible and inspirational. Welcome to the Luminous Mind, Hunter.
Thanks so much for having me, Rebecca.
I'm really excited to talk about the ideas behind your book, The Straight A Conspiracy, Your Secret Guide to Ending the Stress of School and Totally Ruling the World. It sounds quite interesting. But before we get into any of that, would you please tell our audience a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, so I grew up, my dad's Dutch, my mom's American. She's from Kansas City, as we talked about before the podcast. And I grew up all over the world. I was born in Saudi Arabia, lived in Brazil, lived in Greece, lived in England. And so just had this experience of moving around between lots and lots of places and trying to figure out, how do humans work? And because I was moving between so many different cultures, I ended up having to basically try and figure out, there's this thing that's our shared humanity, but then there's also these huge cultural differences and how exactly did that work? So there's, Carol Dweck, shared this old joke that's, science isn't research, it's me search. And so everything we're going to talk about here is very much being a personal journey to try and sort out the mess of the experience of moving around the world, which is great fun, but often quite confusing.
Well, I would imagine it helped add to your education when you're meeting a ton of different people and living all over the world and seeing how everything works. That's great. Well, we've kind of talked about it in your intro, but I really want to find out kind of the inspiration behind your book. It says that you took 7 different fields of neuroscience and psychology and thousands of hours in tutoring for that book. But let's talk about kind of the nuts and bolts behind that and how that became a thing.
Yeah. So, I was, out here. I was tutoring to pay my bills because that's what a lot of people do after college when they have no idea what to do. And so.
Well, and you went to Harvard. That can be cheap, right? Of course, you graduated.
No. Cum laude.
Yeah, cum laude. Yeah.
Fancy. Everything's better when you say it in Latin. The second it's in Latin, now it's like, wow, that's the thing.
I'm too white to say very well.
So I would just hear kids say things like, I didn't get the math gene, I don't have a natural ear for languages, or I'm, just not a natural writer. And, coming from the world of science, these are essentially scientific claims, right? You're claiming that there is some gene that you've identified that prevents your brain from doing well in these classes. Yeah. And so my reaction to all of that was like, okay, let's go see what the scientific literature says, because that's what you're trained to do. And so that's how I ended up working across the 7 fields of neuroscience and psychology. But then, Katie who's my co-author, picked up an entirely different set of problems, which is she's like, these kids are miserable. They're so stressed out. They're not being effective. They're not succeeding. And they really hate their lives. And, it's everything that, we talked about Brett from the School Sucks Project before. And, it's everything that Brett has spoken so eloquently about is just the level of stress and unpleasantness. And so, it's a problem that lots of people see, but just because of, my experience, it ended up being that we ended up trying to use the science to help solve that problem. The whole writing process was essentially, me coming to Katie with all this science, and then her coming from sort of the English and humanities background and being like, okay, now let's figure out how to say that so anybody cares. Now let's figure out how to say that in a way that's digestible. And so it was that dialogue back and forth where we ultimately, it was translating those 7 fields of neuroscience and psychology from, boring academic papers to something as fun and engaging as possible for kids so that the kids could actually use it.
Well, and it is a fun read. There's one thing I love about it. It's got lots of pictures and graphics in it. And then there's lots of funny stories. I love the fact that you debunk the myths, of like, we think, well, I'm not Thomas Edison, but there was a lot of marketing back, in Edison's day to make him look as genius as he is. I mean, not that he wasn't, like your book talks about, but at the same time, we miss the idea that he spent, tens of thousands of hours, failing before he came to, what he had. But because he's been projected, or Mozart, that he wrote his first piece when he was just a child, there's just a lot of marketing in that's kind of helped us make a lot of excuses over the years. Is that correct?
Oh, yeah, totally. And I mean, the thing is that, we all recognize sort of that advertisers are not necessarily the most truthful people and that they have a tendency to hype things and sort of, exaggerate their virtues and downplay sort of the faults or the messy parts of the story. And that's just what humans have always done. It's not something that is new. And so, throughout history, people have understood that if you want to sell things, you build a cult of personality around, you sell the man, and then by selling the man, you sell the product. And so if you listen even, Edison in his own time was known as the Wizard of Menlo Park. And it's very much the same thing as Steve Jobs, who was known as the I God, and they talk about the cult of Mac. And although, it sort of seems like a joke, like obviously Steve Jobs is not a religious figure, except he is, because a lot of what it comes down to is using that emotion of awe, where you are just so in awe of what these people are done and you want to be like them. And, how do you be like them? Well, how do you be like Mike? Well, you buy the hamburger that's next to Michael Jordan's face. But of course, that's not actually how you become Michael Jordan. You become Michael Jordan by lots and lots of practice, and probably not by eating a McDonald's hamburgers or by owning the shoes with the super puffy material.
That's for sure. That's awesome. Well, and you really have to combine the neuroscience behind it, but then there's also the aspect of the emotions that's going into the education. You know, when you're talking about how Katie said that these kids are just hating their lives. One of the things that I loved about in the book is you talk about the fallacy of comparisons, you know, and I think like if you're a homeschooled kid, that's one thing you actually get to escape from is that you're not in a situation, you're just learning. You're not in that situation where you're being compared all the time to other kids. What's your thought process on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, I think it's just worth acknowledging with all this stuff that kids are dumb. Right? Like as little kids, we're all dumb in some senses. And, you know, we're struggling to make sense of the world and we're not necessarily doing a very good job of it. And the job of adults is to sort of curate an environment where, you know, we're like training wheels and we're providing so much support and so much structure at the beginning. And then over time, we're easing those training wheels off. And the problem is that, you know, in sort of traditional regular school, we actually don't provide that structure, really. Like there's structure in the sense that there's four walls and, you know, you're supposed to sit at a desk, but we're not providing the emotional or the psychological support so that kids can properly make sense of their experience. So if you have a kid who's sitting in math class, and I think this is an experience we can all relate to, you know, you sit there and there's somebody in the front row who knows all the answers right away. Now, as a 4-year-old, you know, or a 6-year-old or whatever, what do you think? Well, your first thought is, oh my God, that person is a magical person, right? They've, you know, just like got some gene, especially if you sort of picked up this idea from all this, you know, these advertising jingles about Edison and Mozart that are stuck in all of our heads that we can't get rid of, that some people are these magical, geniusy people. And so then you internalize this idea that this other person is magical. But in fact, you've made an unfair comparison. You don't understand that, you know, that other kid has been practicing their times table again and again and again in the car. So there's all that information that's missing. And as adults, you know, we've learned to be like, okay, I see this thing happening, but there's probably context that I'm missing. But kids don't do that. And so, you know, as responsible adults, we should be making sure, like, okay, how are you making sense of the world? What are you believing here? Why are you believing it? But, you know, our school system is, you know, the more and more you look at it, it's just incredibly bizarre that you're just letting children form their own beliefs about intelligence. And I think it's massively irresponsible. And I think that, yes, the homeschool environment avoids a lot of that because, you know, essentially the only person whose process you're looking at is your own.
Yeah. It's weird how that does creep in, though, because my teen son was saying to me the other day, well, I just don't have very good luck. And I'm like, where does that come from? I mean, yeah, it's not something that I mean, maybe I've said it just in passing and haven't realized it, but it definitely gets put in there that somehow, you know, we aren't lucky enough or we don't have the right genes or whatever, those types of things that your book discusses. But let's kind of go back, though, and maybe talk about some of the challenges that you had along the way in writing this book and what you feel like you've learned from those.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest challenge was, you know, it was really like what's great about working with kids is that, you know, they force you to a level of clarity that, you know, adults don't, right? Like you can't rely on fancy jargon. You know, you're really having to compete for their attention. Like you said, there's a diagram or a picture on every page of the straight A conspiracy, and that was very intentional. And so, you know, we essentially, that audience really forced us to, like, you know, think visually, think in terms of fun, easy little stories, have these little boxes and things like that to break up the text. How do you make it as accessible and fun and relatable as possible? And so, I mean, the challenge was, you know, how do you take all this science that's existed for, you know, 40, 50 years that nobody's ever heard of and turn it into a form that a disgruntled, school-hating teenager can, you know, not only engage with, but appreciate, and then it can turn their life around. And, you know, there are definitely a lot of times, especially early in the process, where, you know, that challenge was like, frustrating. Like it took us a long time to write this book. You know, Katie and I, and people ask us how long did it take us to write the book? And, you know, it was like really 5 years of research and then 5 years of writing.
Wow.
So it took a long time to do. But the point is that ultimately it's like we had to do 10,000 hours on that. And over that time, it moves from being a stressful, frustrating challenge to being fun. And so mostly I now really enjoy breaking down ideas and sharing them and democratizing them, and always trying to figure out how can you communicate more with less.
Yeah. Well, and I love you're saying in the book, there are a lot of great stories that help you relate. I was just thinking the idea of practice that you had in there as you were talking about how long it took you to do this. So your next book should only take you like 2.5 years, right? Because you've laid down that process. You've done the jungle path of the superhighway type of thing.
Yep.
So.
Well, and that's the thing. So you're talking about automaticity, right? So, we sort of identify these 3 things that you need to know about your brain. And, it's that if you do anything often enough, it becomes automatic. So you don't really have to think about it. So the first time you do your ABCs, it's tough. It's like this little dirt path through the jungle. But then you do it often enough, and, that jungle path gets beaten down. And, over time, by walking that road a lot, you clear a real path and ultimately a superhighway through the jungle. The other thing that became really interesting was just the degree to which this book ended up being not just for kids. We had this idea that we were writing it for disgruntled teenagers, but we've gotten feedback from a lot of adults in a lot of different places who are like, I wish I'd had this book when I was in school.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. So we've talked about some of this already, but, what do you feel like are some of the common struggles that students have in getting good grades, other than kind of those preconceived, notions that we have that we don't have the SMART gene?
The number one thing, and it is related to this, but the number one thing is, if I had the ability to have all of humanity know one thing, it's that, there's a reason why we say I feel stupid. And that's because stupid is a feeling. And specifically, it's the feeling of shame. And so what happens is that because people are ashamed of their mistakes or they're ashamed of their bad tests, they wad up those tests, they throw them away, they bury them in a backpack. And it's literally, it's not that there's not a place for shame. It's just that that's a misplaced shame. And really the feeling that you want to cultivate around mistakes is curiosity of why did that happen? Why did that go wrong? Oh, that's interesting. How can we now design things in future so that those mistakes don't repeat them? And the analogy that we use in the book is, this example of the FAA, where when a plane crashes, the FAA gets out all the wreckage, analyzes the wreckage, figure out why that accident happened, and then design systems so that that type of accident doesn't happen again. You can do the same thing with math. And if you keep doing that with math, like flying a plane with the FAA, it will ultimately become really, really safe and reliable math process. But the analogy that I picked up from someone through having these conversations in the mixed mental arts community recently, which I absolutely love, is video games, because it's a much better analogy for kids. And, when you
it's
die,
fun. It's that emotion
it's fun.
Again. Yeah,
that's right. And that's the point. When you die on a video game, right, you don't maybe you rage quit and maybe you throw the controller across the room. but ultimately, it's that you died on that particular level is just a sign that you didn't do something in the right way. And then you have to go back and you have to repractice and you have to keep, making those jungle paths better and better so that you can complete this process of the entire, 10, 20 levels of the video game. Yeah. And that's really all math is, or writing is, or really any of these things are. It's just a process. And if you can, if you really wanted to distill it down, if you could get every human approaching their learning like a video game, where when they die, they're like, oh, time to play again, we would all be a lot better off.
Yeah. Well, and in your book, you talk about the idea of getting good grades. And that's really, I think, where I struggled in school. Like you said, you get the math test and you're all mad and you wad it up and you throw it away. I never, ever looked at it again. And that was really, I think, is a downside of having grades, I guess, per se, because that's all that we're really caring about, is getting the good grades the most important aspect of schooling? Is that, when I looked at the diagram on your website, that's what students think, 94% only care about grades. But really, that like hinder our learning?
I mean, I think it can. I mean, if we're talking, are we now talking like Rebecca and Hunter get to redesign the educational system?
Yes,
exactly. Is that the combo we have? Okay, I like that combo. So if they're like, listen, this whole thing is not working out well. You two had this great podcast. And based on this one great podcast, we think you guys should design the thing from scratch. The number one thing is that I think the biggest problem with grades actually is just how high level they are. So they're a 10,000 foot view, right? So you get a C in math class. Okay, that's telling us some sort of rough thing about an entire year of math. If, on the other hand, we get down to, sort of the like 5 foot view, where we're like, let's say we've got that C in math class, but then we look more carefully and we're like, oh, actually, you really understand fractions well, right? Mm-hmm. But there's this one area of fractions that you don't understand, which is dividing fractions. And then we would come in and we would help you focus and fix that one thing. And so, this is sometimes what's called either, mastery learning or micro competencies or whatever. But we should be really targeted or specific in what it is that we're trying to fix. And the problem is that grades are just so high level. And then again, you're leaving kids to sort of make sense of that information where, it's like, okay, you got a C. And I mean, so much of what Katie and I end up doing when we work with students is like, okay, yeah, you did get a C. Like, that's a thing. We can see it on the piece of paper. But the big question is not a C. It's what does it mean? What does that C tell us? And if you think that C tells you that you're just not good at the subject or you'll never succeed at this or whatever, then you're now out of the process. It's essentially like you saying, I didn't get the Call of Duty gene. I'll never be good at Call of Duty. As opposed to it tells us, oh, something went wrong along the way. And then we have to figure out what do you need to do differently. And so this is, what we call in the straight A conspiracy. We say it's not you, it's what you do. So the C is not you, it is what you do, and you can do better. So I think it's not necessarily that grades per se are problematic, but it's the culture around grades that is hyper problematic. And also, again, like, I don't think, a lot of what our educational system is focused on is manufacturing a curve. It's not actually focused on trying to make as many humans good at these things as possible. It's trying to select out a special group of humans.
Yeah.
And that's a real problem. And it's going to be a bigger and bigger problem as we move into the 21st century. Because it's all based on these very industrial age intuitions that I know Brett talks about, which is that, there's that, Woodrow Wilson quote where, he spoke to the National Association of High School Teachers. And he says, what we want is an educational system which of necessity produces two classes of people. One that is, has the benefits of a liberal arts education and, is very, is essentially a managerial class. And then another much larger by necessity in any society of people who are so dulled and turned off to any type of thinking that they are only suited towards the most menial work. This is what our educational system does. It deliberately, part of it is that it turns off the brains of 90% of the population. So it's not designed to actually educate. It's designed to educate a tiny minority and dull the vast majority. And it does that very effectively.
Yeah. Well, and during the graduation time, there was a video going around that was showing basically, people who are kind of the C average student actually end up being the innovators and the people that really do change the world versus the person who's the valedictorian doesn't necessarily end up being a world changer because they're the type of person that knew how to follow the rules. And that's what they continue to do the rest of their lives is just follow the rules, and they don't really become that innovator. And I have to tell you, it made people mad because there are a lot of parents that even believe those grades. and the fact that their daughter is the valedictorian is way more important than what they end up doing with that knowledge in the future. And that's the sad part of, that's what we're trying to debunk basically, is that those struggles that we have as students they actually make us stronger, and they can end up producing something better in the end versus, trying to just get the good grades. So, and that's what basically your book, even though you talk about grades and it's the straight A conspiracy, I think there's a lot of information in there that helps us understand learning better.
Well, and that's the key thing is, especially since the straight A conspiracy and sort of getting feedback from readers. You mentioned in the bio that I wrote about myself, which is always a very weird experience.
To have it read to you.
Yeah, exactly. But, some of the people who have resonated with are sort of, adults in their 20s and the 30s who, are trying to navigate the world, people in prisons, and then people who are finding themselves being disrupted out of a job and then realizing they have to retool, learn some new skills, figure out a new way to navigate the system. And so I think that's the whole point is that, if you're doing the valedictorian thing, and that video was very sad for Katie because she was the valedictorian. And so to find out that she was on the path to failure, really was a wake up call for her, but those people who have, sort of been following the path, that path doesn't work anymore. So the problem is that, yes, you're like trying to follow a path, but it's like the Ted Stevens Bridge to Nowhere, right?
Yeah.
It's not a path that's going anywhere you want to go. And you have to realize that we all live in an age where there literally is no path. Like nobody knows what technology is going to look like in 20, 30 years. What we do know is that, you have to be very aggressive about your learning and constantly trying to improve your understanding, constantly trying to do better and, sort of practicing, what the Japanese call kaizen or continuous daily improvement. You can only do so much in any given day, but be doing everything that you can. And so what that means is that, a piece of paper that you got 10, 20, 30 years ago doesn't amount to a whole hill of beans, because the difference between the knowledge that was available in, say, 2004 when I graduated from college and now, like, it's so funny. There's a guy out here who I'm buddies with, who I did stand-up comedy when I first moved out here. He's become part of the whole mixed mental arts thing. And, we were talking about how in 2004 and 2005, we had all these amazing conversations about Web 2.0 and MySpace. And like, Jesus, what was this MySpace thing? And like, Dane Cook had 1 million friends. And, blah, 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 blah. And like, this was really changing the world. And of course, like, we're only, 13 years later. And,
like, what's MySpace?
Yeah. How radically different is the world? So it's even, my grandfather and all my dad's family were doctors. And the thing my dad and I always talk about is, when my grandfather graduated from medical school, he really thought like that was all the knowledge he would ever need for the rest of his career. Like, wow. That piece of paper really did mean something. It's like, here, you now know everything you need to practice medicine forever. And,
so
in practice.
Who is he? I don't want to go to. No, I'm just kidding.
Oh, no. He's been out of, he was born in 1908. Okay. So, he's been out of commission for a while. But the point is that, yeah, exactly. Like somebody who is really resting on their laurels, resting on that piece of paper, wherever it's from, whether it's valedictorian or some college degree or some medical degree, and isn't being aggressive about their learning, is the last person that you would actually want delivering services to you.
Yeah, because they haven't innovated and changed and grown from that, for sure. Well, I feel like we're kind of getting off topic, even though these are extremely exciting subjects for us to talk about. But, give us an idea of how you feel like your paradigm about education changed over time and with experience from the time, graduating to now. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
I had a conversation, I remember, with my dad when I was a kid, and sort of, fairly early on, I'd figured out that school was about hoop jumping. And, I used the analogy of like Shamu, right? Yeah. Like, Shamu performs tricks, Shamu gets fish. Shamu doesn't perform tricks, Shamu gets no fish. And so I was like, okay, my job is to be Shamu. Like, I may not get this, I may not think it makes much sense, but I will be Shamu. And that is that valedictorian thing that I did. I was not valedictorian, unlike Katie, but I was very good at performing little tricks and, like getting good grades and all of that sort of stuff. And now I've realized that that completely misses the point of education. And that what that really is about indoctrination. So school does indoctrination. There is a set of knowledge that has been figured out, and then they are trying to force that into your head. And the problem is that it actually makes you think less, because instead what you're just sort of doing is unquestionably accepting whatever the teacher presents. And then what we actually really need is actual education. So education comes from the Latin root educare, to lead out. And where what you're really trying to do is pull out the student, get them engaged. And, it really is all, increasingly, when we started tutoring kids, we were like, okay, we have to get all this knowledge in their head so they can jump through the hoops and get the fish. And then increasingly, we moved away from that. And instead of trying to, sort of push the kid along the bike, we were trying to get them to do it on their own. And so we were just prodding them and nudging them and actually being less and less helpful and just being like, okay, what don't you know? Great. How are you going to figure that out? Okay, great. What else is not working? Great. Why don't you fix that? And this is not, a big, you're a parent, you've hired a tutor, you expect the tutor is going to solve the problem for the kid. You're trying to provide a resource and throw resources at the kid. And what we realize is that what kids really need is resourcefulness. How do they solve their own problems?
Yeah. I've talked to a lot of homeschooling parents, and that's what we kind of focus on here is the homeschooling aspect of it. But it does get exhausting trying to educate somebody else. You know what I mean? It has to turn into a time when they finally take the reins and they make it their own education, and you're just providing assistance versus doing all the work. That doesn't get them anywhere. And that's really, I think, when we talk about the fallacies of schooling, is that they don't ever learn how to take the reins. And then for the rest of their lives, that's like 18 years of their lives that somebody's telling them what to learn. But then for the rest of their lives, they're kind of floundering. Do you know what I mean? They don't understand how to learn or how to use the knowledge that they have to find skills of other things. Anyway, that's kind of what I was thinking, is that, there does come a time when you have to take the reins and drive your own education.
Yeah, and crucially, that's what you're saying is that the school system creates dependency.
Oh, yeah.
And dependency is, a real problem. And what we want to be focusing on is independency, right? We want to constantly be figuring out how can the student do more and more for themselves so that you can do less and less, Rebecca. So you can put your feet up, have a cup of tea or coffee, and watch the eclipse.
Which is happening in a couple days as we record this. So.
And you had the good fortune to live right in the path of totality, which is brilliant. It's brilliant. It was very smart choice. Some people, are getting hotel rooms there, but you actually just straight up moved there, which is a real level of commitment to seeing this eclipse that I don't think many people can claim.
If you knew how much we are all excited for this thing to be over, you would know. We want to be hidden. We like being in Idaho because nobody knows where it's at.
Yep. Yeah. Well, and then, and that's the funny thing. It's like, it's not that they're shining a spotlight on you. They're shining an unspotlight on you. Yeah, and the unspotlight is just bringing everyone to you. Awesome. But anyway, I think that's the point is that, our whole job, Katie and I, is to put ourselves out of a job. And that was literally always our mentality. Is it became a game of like, how few sessions can we do? And then them being like, we actually don't need you anymore. Like, sorry, you're the worst business people on the planet. Just put yourself out of a job. And that is what a tutor should do. And the point of the Straight A Conspiracy is like, you actually don't even need to hire Hunter and Katie. Like, you can get the $14 book. And it's the manual that'll tell you everything you need to know so that, you don't even need that. And I think, our whole thing is a large part of what we want to do is we want to destroy the tutoring industry. Like, honestly, because most of it is just like part of that dependency culture And
of like, you need me in order to succeed.
Of course.
Yeah.
And if you really care about your child, then you would spend the like $20,000 and the this and this. And there's a great prep course. And, it's really important. Oh, no, this is a transition from high school to college. It's tough. You're going to need a course for that. And that is that whole culture. It's parasitic. I mean, I compare the tutoring industry to the funeral industry. Because, when funerals happen, right, like that's when they start guilting people. And it's like, oh, do you really love mom and dad? Well, you should check out the sleeper deluxe coffin. Like really set them off in style. It has a mini bar and a TV inside.
You want them really comfortable.
Yeah, in the afterlife. It's the same culture, and it's insane. And it's not, is it good for, the people who run these tutoring companies? Yeah, it is. But is it good for America or for the world, or is it good for the kids, or is it good for the parents? No. And so at a certain point, when the system has become that insane, actually the biggest opportunity is to put the system out of business.
That's awesome. Before we go on, let's listen to this message. Recently, the Luminous Mind became an affiliate for EduSense, which offers tremendous discounts on educational supplies. I personally use EduSense to purchase our family supplies because of their great prices, responsive shipping times, and best of all, the chance to earn EduBucks, which I use towards future purchases. Who doesn't love a great deal within a deal? To get a 90% savings on your EduSense materials, go to theluminousmind.net and click on the sponsor page to find the affiliate link. Start using EduSense to illuminate your educational experience. Welcome back to The Luminous Mind with Hunter Maats, breaking down the straight 8 conspiracy. That's what we want to do. We want to put the parents that are listening and the teachers out of business so that people take control of their own education. So let's talk a little bit more about your book. In the intro, we talked about there are 7 different fields of neuroscience and psychology. Let's kind of dive into that and really get to the nuts and bolts of it.
Yeah, so there are 3 things. We talked about the genius myth. So that's the first part, understanding awe, understanding advertising, understand how your brain is hijacked. And it's important to know why awe even exists. Like, why do we have this emotion? So awe is there, like in the ordinary world as sort of a small village, you would be in awe of, say the blacksmith, or in awe of the hunter or the potter or, the old medicine woman or whoever it was. And you would want to know all of their secrets. And so you would hang around their house. You'd try and like dress and act like them. You'd copy everything that they were doing. And then you would spend enough time and have that mentorship that you would ultimately learn everything that they know. What advertising does is that it hijacks those awe mechanisms, but most of us never meet our heroes. So I met Jim Watson. And so it was essentially, the analogy that I use is that it's like Toto in The Wizard of Oz, where, the Wizard of Oz has this big booming face that we all see and we're like, oh my God, Oz is so powerful. And then Toto, the scrappy little dog, sort of goes up to the curtain and pulls the curtain back and reveals there is no wizard, there's only a man. And that's true for all of these geniuses. And so a really, really great exercise that if you're a homeschool parent you can do, that they're probably not going to do in schools anytime soon, is just start pulling back the curtain on all your kids' heroes. So, okay, you're in awe of this business person or this scientist or this artist or this writer or this thinker or this athlete. How did they get as good as they got? And really start trying to understand how that happened. And the more you do that, what's going to happen is that you're going to move the kid from just feeling like this person is magical to starting to really think about process, right? How do they actually do these things and how can they reliably succeed and produce great results? So it moves from sort of, again, believing in magical people to like, oh, there are things we do to achieve this. So that's sort of, I think, the biggest takeaway from chapter 1. And then the next part of the book is the 3 things you need to know about your brain. So from these 7 different fields of neuroscience, we're like, okay, scientists, there's a lot of detail here, but what do people actually need? And it's really 3 things. We talked about 1, which is automaticity. Anything you do often enough becomes automatic. That's just habits. And a lot of school is about building good habits as opposed to bad habits. The second one is attention. So what you put your attention on is how you control what habits you form or what habits you unform, right? So, and it's the dance between automaticity and attention that is really the basis of learning anything. So you put your attention on your ABCs, you automate those. You now no longer have to think about your ABCs. So now you can put your attention on words until you automate those, and then you no longer need to think about those. And then you put your attention on so on and so forth, and you build up to more and more complex things. And math or, a foreign language or computer programming or anything like that, through that dance back and forth of automaticity and attention, you can build up any skill that you want. And so this comes to one of the most important insights from the Straight A Conspiracy. If you can learn one thing, you can learn anything. The fact that, you've learned how to speak or walk or talk or read or write or anything like that means that you can break down, learn, and ultimately master computer programming or graphic design or cooking or, I've supposedly tying your shoes, but I still haven't figured that one out yet.
If it's important to you, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You can learn it if it's important to you.
Yeah, and to fix tying my shoes, it's going to take some real what we call fix-it-focus practice, where you're, rather than just sort of tying your shoes 1,000 times, you're really breaking down, okay, Hunter, how are you tying your shoes? Oh, you're tying your shoes backwards because when your father taught you to tie your shoes, he literally just tied your shoes rather than thinking about how it would have to be the other way around. And then you probably have to go on YouTube and watch some videos and maybe learn some knots, maybe go look at some sailing stuff if you really want a really intense knot. Oh no, now that knot is so tight that it can't be untied. So now you have to like readjust your process. And, it's a silly example, but the point is that it is that constantly sort of working and reworking your process that is actually what effective learning is about. And so that's, attention and automaticity and fix-it-focus practice. But the third big thing you have to know about your brain, which is the thing that really either supercharges this process or entirely derails it, is emotions. We often in the West, there's what's called Descartes' error, right? Which is this idea that there's reason and then there's emotion and they're separate. And it's a really, really bad idea. Thinking and feeling are always linked. That's part of what we now know from the neuroscience. And, right now, you and I are both pretty calm. So it's not obvious what emotions are driving our thinking. But that doesn't mean that there aren't feelings that aren't influencing our thoughts. And, I always think that the best analogy for a lot of this stuff is a marriage or a relationship. Because, when you're first to meet someone, you're in love. They can do no wrong. They just seem perfect and amazing. There are no problems. Then you have your first fight. And suddenly, where before you could see only their virtues, now you see only their faults. You're like, oh, my God, how did I ever think that there's anything worthwhile to this person? And then if the relationship, lasts, then there's this dance back and forth between, love and hate and, curiosity and contempt and anger. And as you go through all of those emotions over time, you come to evolve a much more realistic picture of the person. Those feelings are always there, but often it takes work to sort of make them obvious. And so you have a kid who's, say, wadding up their test or throwing it away. It's not that they necessarily are sitting there and it's obvious that they're being driven by shame, but that behavior of throwing the thing away is happening again and again and again. And so you have to essentially deliberately trigger that emotion by making them confront their mistakes. And boy, does it sometimes drive them nuts.
Yeah.
But if you keep on bringing them back to those mistakes and just being like, it's okay, I understand this. I understand why this would make you feel uncomfortable. I went through the same thing. But here's the thing. If you can learn to embrace and analyze your mistakes, then rather than them continuously biting you on the butt, you'll be able to fix them now once and for all, and then you can move on to the next thing.
Yeah. And emotions is really where I found the most success in kind of being a homeschooling parent, is that when I see my kids upset, that's okay. Take a break for a minute. Let's calm down a little before we go back to that. And I think helping kids see that really helps them understand the emotions that might go into learning too, so that when they see themselves like getting frustrated with something, they can pull back for a minute and get those emotions under control so that you can, it opens up those learning receptacles again, I guess, in the brain. Anyway, that's how I see it. So.
Yeah, well, I mean, you see it that way because you, Rebecca, like me, and like all of these listeners, are human, right? And, we've all had these experiences, and it just requires, developing an awareness of these emotions so that you can manage them. And as Katie O'Brien will tell you, in 2004 when we started, or 2005 when we started working together, my awareness of my own emotions was very low. So this experience has changed my life immensely for the better. And I got far more out of this than I ever got out of formal schooling. Because, you're having to actually engage in the real world. You're trying to help real people. And
moving through a process type of thing.
And it's been a huge process. And so it's very much the same thing. And, when we teach, we learn. I mean, it's you trying to figure out, how do I help my kid, or, any parent trying to do that, or anybody else trying to do that with any human. The more you try and help other humans, the more you end up helping yourself, because you're just like, oh, yeah, that's how we humans work.
A lot of it is driven by the desire to take care of yourself versus somebody else. And then once you got that down, then you have no problem turning around and trying to help other people. But you want to, there's always a kind of a selfish thing involved in learning, which is good in a way. But at the same time, and we turn around and we teach it again, and that helps somebody else.
Yep. And I think that's the point is, what's amazing is that, we live in the age of the internet. You can host a podcast. I can host a podcast. Our book was printed with print on demand. And, these technologies are available for us to have conversations online. And the more that we are all sort of teaching each other and sharing our, best practices and what works for us, we can really start to turn things around pretty quickly. Because, it's just a question of, there's a couple of artists in the UK, Fantic and Young, that have they're a husband and wife team, and they make art together. And they reached out to us. And one of the things they shared with us, which I absolutely adored, is that they realized long ago that we could either gang up on each other or gang up on the problem. And that's the thing, is that a lot of what ends up happening between parents and students is that they're ganging up on each other.
Yeah.
Rather than ganging up on the problem of like, hey, listen, I don't like this, right? I don't like that you're stressed, that you're not doing well. It makes me nervous about your future. It makes me feel like a failure as a parent. I don't know how to solve this, right? You don't like this. You don't like having these arguments. You don't like me trying to ground you and me trying to figure out, how to get you to try. And I don't think you like doing poorly in school. You'd much rather be kicking butt, really learning things, really enjoying yourself. So why don't we, instead of ganging up on each other, let's gang up on the problem? How do we make this thing work? And when you see that shift and that flip happen in a household, that's when you're really off to the races, because now you've unleashed really the wisdom of that little crowd of the family, and they really start solving problems together. And everybody's trying to figure out what we can do to do better together.
Yeah. Oh, that's cool. That's awesome, because that's kind of how I see a lot of millennials. And like we talked about with the School Sucks project and stuff, some of the younger people are no longer just accepting the way it was and putting your kids back through a system that you already hated. They're actually working hand in hand with the student to try to find ways that work for learning versus, just torturing your child the same way. And then we all gang up. Oh, yeah, now I'm the parent, so I get to tell you what to do, like my parents told me what to do, type of thing. And I think that's healthy. That's finally coming to a healthy place where we're looking introspectively and trying to help and work together. So I mean, we kind of talked about some different things, advice for parents, like, debunking some of the myths of heroes that your kids might have, or, trying to help them with the emotions and stuff. But do you feel like there's other things that would help parents with their students with their schoolwork?
I mean, there's an unlimited number of things that you could do, but
working hand in hand.
Yeah, I would say the other thing that I think is something that is super important, especially for homeschool parents, is that your job is actually to not know the material, because that's always the biggest thing is that, like parents are often helping their kids with, sort of like early multiplication, addition, ABCs, whatever. And they're like, I got that material down. I feel comfortable helping them with that. But then you start to get into, okay, what if the kid is taking a class that I didn't take in 20, 30 years, so I don't remember this material anymore? Or what if the kid is taking a class I never took? Then suddenly parents think that because they don't have that content knowledge that they can't help the kid. But that's the whole point. That's when you're the most helpful to the kid. Because what you really need to do for the kid is model the behavior of how we go from not understanding something to figuring it out. And so for them to see you sort of be persistent and be patient and struggle through that and break it down and look things up and keep clarifying things together, that's how they're going to be like, oh, this is actually what humans have to do in order to figure things out. And one of the analogies I use is IKEA furniture, right? IKEA furniture can be frustrating as all get out, but it's a thing that it is doable by any human. It just requires patience and tenacity, and then, puzzling through those Swedish instructions. And it's the same thing with any school material. A textbook is a manual, right? It may not be a very well-written manual. It may not be a very approachable manual. And there are lots and lots of resources now online for free that you can use to break these things down. But it is all IKEA furniture. And so, if we approach school in that mindset, like ideally we're approaching it like a video game and we're having fun, but as a sort of, first step for getting into there, we can just think of it like IKEA furniture. Nobody necessarily enjoys building this stuff, but we know it can be done. And we know that, if we just keep breaking the bits down, and, part 3 of the Straight A Conspiracy is all practical tips on, essay writing, reading, memorizing and learning things, breaking down the rules of math, checking your work. So that's all there. But it's all basically like, as a first step, you can think of it like IKEA furniture.
That's awesome. And if you move and you've glued your IKEA furniture, you're totally screwed. Especially if you buy a 100-year-old house and you can't get anything down the stairs because it's too narrow. Well, here are lessons to be learned.
That's a good lesson. That's a good lesson.
I love what you just said, though, because I really think it debunks, you hear all the time as a homeschooling parent, oh, I could never do that because I'm not smart enough, or I don't know this or that. But the cool thing is I think you just debunk the myth of you don't have to have all the answers. You just have to be a willing partner with your child to help them find the answers. And that's what's most important. You're probably a better tool, not knowing anything, going in blind, than you would be if you had a teaching degree or something like that. I mean, that can kind of stop you from really doing what you need to do, which is helping your child find the resources and not being the resource.
Exactly. And I think especially when you look at, where the 21st century is headed, right? It already is there, but where it's headed, right?
Yeah.
Again, the knowledge that your kid is going to need in 20, 30 years literally hasn't been invented yet. So your teacher can't teach you what you're going to need in the future of your career. So you had better be very good at teaching yourself. And that's what we really want is that, we don't, it's not about how we help students. It's how we help students become teachers so they can teach themselves whatever is required. And that's a thing that has existed before. I mean, there's this book that I absolutely adore, David McCulloch's 1776.
Oh, that's
and
a
he
good
tells,
one.
it's so good. And there's this great story in there about Henry Knox, who was a Boston bookstore owner and, was a portly fellow. And there were these cannons up at Ticonderoga. and Washington wanted them brought down. And he says, Henry Knox, you're the man for the job. And he's like, what are you talking about? I'm a bookstore owner. I know nothing about artillery. And he goes, exactly. That's why I got you this book. Go figure it out. And if you look, especially in that first century or so of the American experiment, there were a lot of people the guys who built the Erie Canal were self-taught. And so there's no reason why you can't, and there's this great line that McCulloch has in 1776 where he says it was a day and age where it was believed that a man by serious and diligent application of books could teach himself whatever was required. And, there were people who existed like that in 1776. But in 2017, that I was like, what year are we in? In 2017, it's going to be vital that you teach yourself whatever is required. Like, that's not an optional thing anymore.
Yeah, we got to go back to that. World. Yeah.
Yep.
We've already gone kind of long, but I really want to hear about your podcast, The Mixed Mental Arts. Yep. What's that about? Like, I want to hear about your new stuff that you're doing. Tell us about
yeah.
Stuff
So
like that.
What happened was that Brian Callen. So Brian Callen's dad was my dad's boss at Citibank in Saudi Arabia, and the first house that I ever went to after being born was the Callen household. So I've known Brian Callen literally my whole life. But we sort of didn't really know each other. Brian was out here. He did Mad TV. He was Pool Boy. And then he, has done a bunch of cameos in movies like The Hangover and Old School and a whole bunch of other things. And Brian had this podcast that because he was sort of like, we argue, is he a B-list actor or a C-list actor? We're not quite sure. But, he was sort of like just sort of not really booking anybody that he actually cared about. He wasn't really focused on it. And then Brian and I would have all these conversations about books because Brian loves to read. And I was like, Brian, you have kind of a lot of downloads for this thing without even really trying. If you wanted, we could actually book like all of these authors on your show. And he's like, really? You would talk to that guy who had that 3-minute scene in The Hangover? And I was like, I think they just care about audience numbers, and like academics are really just excited to get their ideas out there. So he's like, well, if you think they would, you could start booking some of these people as guests. So I basically just used Brian's fame to book anybody that I wanted to talk to. And, that's sort of that list of people like Carol Dweck, Jared Diamond. And then let's see if you can do this. You want to go
MIT
Turkish?
economist, Darren.
Yeah.
Asimov. I don't know Asimov.
That is a really tough one.
I'm swearing here.
Yeah, well, I also screwed that one up because at some point I was just like Asimoglu. And then people are like, actually, that's a silent G. There's a special silent G in Turkish, and it has like a little curvy loop on top. But most people leave that off. I was like, okay, great, Darren. So we had Darren on the show, and after having all these academics on the show, we were like, man, this is amazing. Like everybody thinks that the answers to our problems don't exist. They do. They're just trapped in books, and they're just scattered across all these different academic fields. And we were like, we need to put this stuff together, and we need to put it together in a form that everybody can appreciate. And because Brian loves mixed martial arts, we were like, okay, why not do mixed mental arts? Why not take all these ideas and sort of blend them together into a single worldview? That's really what we've been focused on doing. And in essence, that's sort of the challenge for what's going on right now, because it's like everybody got given a microphone with the internet. And now how do we sort of like hash out our differences and come to a more realistic worldview that's going to deliver, a better life for our kids, better prosperity, and just in general, a better system. And we are going to be launching this mixed mental arts belt system that is sort of, takes these hundreds of books and distills it down to 9 principles.
Wow.
So,
all that reading, and then we're coming down with 9 principles. But they are, once we learn the principles, we can learn anything, right? Is that the idea behind it?
That's the thing. It's going to really, really speed up the process. And I mean, it's just like an extra sort of level to complement the straight A conspiracy. And, that's the idea. So we're pretty excited about these 9 principles.
Awesome.
And I mean, it's literally, there's like a blog post and stuff like that explains it, but literally it's 9 sentences. That's small of an ask as you could get.
That's funny. Well, that's great. When does that launch then? Has it launched, the 9 principles?
We recorded the sort of intro podcast, which we haven't released yet. And then, like, again, the amazing thing of the internet, we have volunteers from all over the world who have jumped in not only to help write this stuff, and everything's written and doing graphic design. And then we have people helping build the website. So, there's somebody named Mandy Ainsley who's in South Africa. She's helping build the website right now. Brian Atoya, who is in Washington, D.C. Kate Fogarty, who we talked about before the podcast, helped write it. Nate McCabe, who lives in France. Katie O'Brien helped with a lot of this stuff. And then Matt Madonna, who's in Arizona, is doing the graphic design. And then Nicole Lee Page is in Virginia. And
wow.
8 months ago, I had not met most of these people. And that's the great thing is that with the internet, you can be like, hey, I'm doing this thing. I want to solve this problem. Who else wants to help solve this problem? And then again, instead of ganging up on each other, we can gang up on the problem. And the problem is there are 60 million scientific papers and 130 million books. And it's not reasonable for anybody to, expect somebody who is like trying to make a living, has a job, has kids, anything like that, to go and read through all of that. No individual human can. So we should all help each other break down and make sense of these things. So it's taking that idea of the straight A conspiracy of let's take 7 fields of neuroscience and psychology and synthesize it down and just take it to a whole new level.
That sounds awesome. Well, I'm excited to, when you go ahead and launch it, let me know, because I'd love to be part of that and help any way I can. But before we say goodbye, though, do you kind of feel like maybe there is some habits that you could put in your personal life that might help you with your learning and being able to conquer the world, to take over the world, to totally rule the world with just some habits like that?
Yeah. Again, the great thing about teaching, I think, is that you're like, hey, kid, you should do this. And then you're sort of like, oh, and so should I.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I like, a lot of sort of what has been happening in my life. And, my mother will love to hear this. So, is I have for a long time been heavily focused on books and academics. Sort of for me, it was, I don't know what the analogy would be, but, the athletic conspiracy, like I identified heavily as a nerd and not as a jock. And so I've been having to work my way into handling my feelings around athleticism and working out. And then also just in general, tidying up after myself in my apartment. I mean, that's the one that my mother's really going to love. There's just a lot of feelings there, like honestly, and I'm aware that I have a problem, and that really is step one. And, just I've been, Marie Kondo's book, The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up, has been very helpful because I realize that mostly I just need to throw a lot of things away. But yeah, the point is that yes, we all have to do this, and it's the nature of the process is that you're like, man, I'm kicking butt, I'm doing great in this, and then you're like, oh, there's this whole other area that I haven't looked at.
Well, and I really think, going back to the positives of homeschooling, it basically is that when you're there with your kids like 24/7, all of a sudden your faults are all staring you in the face. You know what I mean? Like
yep.
All of a sudden you realize like, wow, I can't push this kid to read if I never pick up a book myself, or I can't push this kid to do this if I never, host my own podcast, or type of thing where all of a sudden you decide you have to be the leader in that and not just telling somebody what to do. And hopefully we're all creating good positive emotions around that as we do it.
Yeah. I mean, I think so. Brett and I talked about this a little bit. There's, the famous line from Jesus about how you see the splinter in your brother's eye so clearly, but, don't see the log in your own eye.
Yeah, exactly.
And I mean, that is the great thing about, what you're saying about homeschooling or, my experience with tutoring is that makes you incredibly, you suddenly start to realize the giant log in your own eye. And then you just have to and that's when your life really changes, is when you become more and more obvious about that log in your own eye, and then are like, oh God, I have to deal with this. And you really sort of handle this, you embrace the social pressure of man, I really can't expect anybody else to do this in these other areas if I don't do it myself.
Yeah. Well, I love the self-ownership there again. I mean, going back to kind of our founding fathers of, they took a lot of self-ownership. And I think nowadays we want to blame, parents want to blame teachers and teachers want to blame parents and everyone wants to blame society and, the movie industry and stuff like that. But it really comes down to having a self-awareness that we all need to change and become better.
And understanding that when you're blaming other people, you're disempowering yourself.
Oh, yeah.
You're basically saying you have all the power, you have all the control, I have none. And so that's also, a large part of, what happens with students, right, is they're blaming a gene, or they're blaming not having an ear for language, or they're blaming their teacher, or they're blaming whatever. And, where did they learn those habits? Well, they learned it from all of us.
Yeah.
So if we want them to change, again, we have to change ourselves.
Yeah.
So couldn't agree more, Rebecca.
Awesome. Well, I'm totally starstruck from listening to Hunter on the School Sucks podcast. But before we say goodbye, do you have any parting, wisdom for our listeners? And then give us your contact information, how we can find you and your podcast and all of these wonderful things we talked about.
Well, I think the most important parting word is there's no reason to be starstruck.
I'm Toto. I'm trying to pull back the curtain, but I'm so starstruck.
And that's the point. Yeah, you just got to Toto it. And, Steve Jobs has there's this great video of Steve Jobs sort of talking in 1994. And he says, when you grow up, you're taught, sort of play by the rules. Don't bash against the walls too much. Try and make a little money and mostly just keep the system as it is. And he says the greatest day of your life is when you realize that the world was invented by people no smarter than you.
Exactly.
And that's the point. So, Rebecca, that when the more you embrace that, and the more we all embrace that really no one is any smarter than anybody else. They may have know different things. They may have had different opportunities and different exposure. But ultimately, if anybody can do this, then so can you. So I think that's the main thing is, what has sort of really become clear is that's what we're really focused on is so can you.
Well, and the humility, I think that's maybe going back to 1776, some of our founders had is sometimes having that humility of I don't know everything, and you're willing to ask and you're willing to understand that you don't know everything is sometimes the greatest strength that you can have.
Yep. There's a great book by Edward Hess and Catherine Ludwig called Humility is the New Smart. And that is spot on. So yeah, we could literally talk all day. But all this stuff, our whole goal, and it's important to recognize that mixed mental arts is really a community of people, and that we're all focused on breaking down these ideas and making them available for everyone. Anybody can start a mixed mental arts dojo. So it's essentially a book club, reading group. You could start your own podcast. All of the ideas we're breaking down, we want them to move. That's our whole idea. So anything you like, take it, make it your own. As we say, steal like an artist. That's, I think, the most important thing to realize is that, these ideas don't belong to anyone. And, as you said with our founders, Jefferson has the great quote about, how an idea is like a candle. Right. And if I light your candle with my candle, it doesn't make my world darker. It makes both of our worlds brighter. Yeah. So that's very much our idea is just everybody sort of lighting each other's candles. So there's a Mixed Mental Arts podcast. You can find that on iTunes, on Stitcher, on all of the usual feeds. There's mixedmentalarts.co, which is a website. There's a Mixed Mental Arts Facebook group. The belt system and the new website will be launching soon. There's, the usual range of sort of Twitter feeds at Mixed Mental Arts. There's the at Straight A Conspiracy Twitter feed, which is STR, the number 8, A Conspiracy. It killed Katie O'Brien to use the number 8 because the grammarian in her was not okay with that, but there's a Twitter count limit. So that's that at Hunter Maats. You can follow me there. And then The Straight A Conspiracy is available on Audible, it's available on Kindle, and it's available at Amazon.com.
And it's available in Spanish now, too, I saw.
It is.
Awesome.
La conspiración de las calefacciones perfectas. So, yeah.
That's
So
awesome.
if you want it in Spanish, you can also get it in Spanish. We really, our whole idea is that, we think that everybody deserves to have these ideas and these tools, and anything we can do to support anyone anywhere, we're very accessible. You can always find me on any of these things. And, unlike certain people, I'm not up my own butt. And, we can actually have a conversation.
Well, he accepted my invitation to come on here. And so I've been having a great time with Hunter Maats and learning so much. I'm smiling. So obviously my emotions are, in a good check. I've been laughing a lot. So I've had a great time. I hope everybody else has, talking to Hunter. But again, his company website is thestraightaconspiracy.com. That's where you can find more about his book. But we'll be sure to link all the information, including his Twitter handles and all of those type of things with his podcast on our website as well. But thank you so much, Hunter, for coming on and joining us and helping to light our minds on fire on this important topic of education. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, and good luck with that eclipse. I hope the tourists aren't too annoying.
Thank you for listening to The Luminous Mind. To learn more about Hunter Maats, go to our show notes, theluminousmind.net. Be sure to become a subscriber to our free email list. Then check out the Services tab to see how we can continue to assist you, our fire starters. Also, to help us continue production of illuminating content, go to the Sponsor tab at theluminousmind.net for more information on sponsorship and affiliate programs. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, Google+, Pinterest, and now Instagram. Get our free audio content by subscribing on YouTube, iTunes, and Stitcher. To help us grow, consider these easy ways. Tell your friends about us, leave us a review, share our content. Tell us how we can help you so together we can continue to light minds on fire and change the paradigm of education.